but in an ever-shrinking world. Our success in these efforts will be determined not only by what we build in Schenectady, but also what we can sell in Shanghai. For America to compete around the world, we need to export more goods around the world. That's where the customers are. It's that simple.
It was quite the photo op. President Obama with GE CEO Jeffrey Immelt ogling new production at a factory in upstate New York. And they hit together on what is likely to be the theme of this week, competitiveness and trade, particularly exports. But is what's good for corporate America really the solution for what ails Americans? And is this move really about jobs or, as some have suggested, about corporate cash a year after Citizens United? To discuss all this and more, we bring in Heidi Shierholz, economist at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and with me in studio, Erica Payne, founder of the Agenda Project and the Tesseract consulting firm. Let's start with you, Erica. That was kind of deep. Abroad is where the customers are. That actually speaks volumes about our economy.
It does speak volumes about the economy. I mean, it is correct that 95% of the world's customers are abroad. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is success, for whom? Success is in the eye of the beholder, obviously. And when corporations do well, we've seen a lot of examples where the American people don't do so well.
Heidi, to you on the same question. I mean, I remember the big excitement about George W. Bush being the first NBA president. He added, what, $5 billion to our debt? Is it actually true that what's good for corporate America is good for Americans?
I think the recent experience actually speaks to that. Right now, corporate profits have returned to pre-recession levels. They're back to, sort of the boom of the bubble years. And the labor market is still down over 11 million jobs. So that says it right there that what's good for corporations is not necessarily good for America. A corporation can make profits by cutting wages, by cutting workers. That's not necessarily what's going to make this country prosper. So we have to think very carefully before we say business leaders are going to make the best CEOs of the country.
Yeah, business leaders bring something to it. I mean, you're a Wharton Business School graduate, Erica. I mean, what do you think is the upside of business expertise?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the great myths in American politics is that business people do things so much better than government people do. But I would challenge, the CEO of GE to make a decision that 100 people could veto or, put a silent hold on, that kind of thing. So I think that part of the problem that we have in our politics is that just in general, we have deified the businessman while we've denigrated government workers, and it's been an ongoing, marketing campaign on behalf of the right, and it's not actually accurate. So when you get somebody in there who's a business leader, he or she may or may not be able to run a government because it's a fundamentally different exercise.
And GE in particular, I mean, Paul Krugman writing in the Times points out, I hate to mention it, but this is a company with more than half of its workers overseas and more than half of its profits and revenues coming from its financial division, GE Capital. Heidi, talk to the specific choice of Immelt to head up this, new council on job creation.
That's right. So he's the head of a company that's exactly what you said. They have he admitted 60% of their revenues come from foreign operations. So I don't have anything against Immelt. I don't know him as a man, but what we need to make sure we have here is somebody who will focus on what we need to do to get the jobs back. And this focus on competitiveness is really a misplaced focus. We right now have a trade deficit that's lower than it was before the recession started. We were brought into this recession not because of a competitiveness problem, but because of the bursting of an $8 trillion housing bubble. The situation that we have now is an utter lack of demand across the board. It's that working on the trade deficit will help. We can get jobs that way, but that's a dollar policy issue. That's the lever that we could pull there to really deal with the trade deficit. But the main point here is that competitiveness, that's not what's wrong with this country.
I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I think equating corporate competitiveness with American competitiveness is to couple two things that don't necessarily need to be coupled. But if you look at education in the United States and compared to international counterparts, you know, you look at significant numbers of countries, China being ahead in math, science, and English, and us placing around 23 or 24 in those areas. You look at China investing $600 billion in an infrastructure, and we have a Republican Congress who's about to take, has pledged to take $500 billion out of the budget. So the United States competitiveness, I certainly think, is an appropriate conversation to have, and incidentally, the right political frame for Obama to take.
But you don't necessarily measure a state's competitiveness or a country's competitiveness in the same way that you do a company's.
And I think that's exactly right. And that's where we've gotten really confused as a country. And if you look at GE, just for example, part of the reason that GE's CEO is able to come into this job is because GE has not been tainted with the financial bailout. Like Lloyd Blankfein certainly would not have gotten this job, the CEO of Goldman Sachs. But if you look at GE, they actually had to get a special exception to get bailout money because they're actually a financing company, but they still have that brand of they bring good things to life.
So they got the money, they just didn't get the taint.
That's exactly
Here's what
right.
Immelt had to say about what creates jobs and unemployment.
American business is more productive today than it's ever been, and that has had an impact on overall employment. But the most important part is we've got to invest and we've got to drive exports. You know, 95% of the world's population is outside the United States. Ultimately, to create manufacturing jobs, we've got to be innovating and we've got to be exporting.
Now, that's another heavy statement, too, Heidi. I mean, he makes the point that his company and others are more productive, but we know unemployment has stayed at over 10%, or roughly 10%. We are more productive, but it's fewer people doing more for less, isn't it?
Yeah, and so productivity is not the problem here. The productivity of the American worker is not what's driving unemployment. It's the lack of demand for goods and services. So it's a demand problem, not a productivity or a lack of skills problem. And I just wanted to say I really agree with Erica that, and I would be very happy if the administration in this jobs and competitiveness agenda, if they are framing competitiveness as the result of that being that we need to invest in education and infrastructure, that's great. That's exactly what I want. If we think about the competitiveness in those terms, that's exactly where we need to invest in order to bring back jobs.
But a CEO of GE is exactly trained not to think in those terms. I mean, he thinks in terms of productivity and keeping costs down. That's us.
Right, and I think he's taking a pretty short-term view of productivity because ultimately what will need to happen in the cycle that we're going into is to create innovation. The way that you create innovation is to create an educated and creative workforce. And so even if you drill down into some of the kinds of education that we are doing in this country, it's not the kind of education that will lead to the sort of out-of-the-box thinking that will create new markets.
Now, everybody there this weekend, certainly the president, Immelt too, they both talked about the need for investment. The big elephant in the living room is that private companies are sitting on, what is it, $2-3 trillion in assets that they're not investing, even as they're bringing in profits from outsourcing and bringing down production costs. What is going to shift that? And is it a CEO that's going to shift that, or a really pro-the-people government?
Well, I mean, this is one of the places where, oddly enough, some intellectual conservatives could find some agreement with more progressive people, because what you want to do is to raise demand. And one way to raise demand, well, there are two ways to raise demand, really. One is to cut taxes, but specifically to cut taxes on people who make below maybe $50,000 a year, because they actually spend that money, unlike doing what the president and the Congress did at the end of last year, which is to cut taxes for people who make more than $1 million a year. And so, and the other way is direct government spending, which tends to, you know, if you actually pay somebody to go build a road, you not only put that person to work so that they can spend money to put other people to work, but you also have a road that can carry goods and services more effectively.
Yet this is what we're talking about still when it comes to changing the economy. Hear from Eric Cantor, Majority Leader in the House.
Look at the Wall Street Journal, the piece by Dick Armey of Freedom Works, the Tea Party group. He said what Congress should cut, and the subheadline says this: let's scrap the Departments of Commerce and Housing and Urban Development and farm subsidies and end urban mass transit grants just for starters. Would those be on the table?
Everything, David, is on the table. I mean, we've got to do...
Cancer research is on the table.
We've got to, listen, we've got to do what families in this country are doing, what businesses are doing. You've got to learn to do more with less. You can't afford to sustain this level of borrowing and spending. Everyone knows that.
So what's on the table is cuts, not the kind of investing that you're talking about.
Right, and part of what he said, that, I mean, it's just idiotic, actually, because if I'm trying to increase my individual potential to bring in more revenues to my individual bank account over my lifetime, one of the smart investments that I would make, which I did make, was to go to business school or graduate school or college or whatever it is. That investment cost me $100,000 in 2 years of lost wages. It certainly paid off, and the United States, you know, it is not a family, which I think is one of the false parallels that people draw, but at the same time, this is not about cutting back. You don't tell a family, don't send your kid to college because you've got to cut back now. What you say is scrape in some areas so that you can make that investment, so you put yourself on a trajectory where your earnings have potential to go up and increase at a faster rate.
Quickly, Heidi, your comment?
I think that's absolutely right. And this question of whether businesses aren't investing, how do we get them to invest? What we know is when we look at business surveys, the reason businesses aren't hiring right now is because of a lack of sales. That's what they say. It's not because of uncertainty. It's not because they don't know what's going on. It's because that they don't have demand for their goods and services. So if we get the government in there to do the investment, that'll generate demand and start that virtuous cycle going faster. We'll pick up demand for investment.
You're talking about sales here as well as overseas. Erica, just very quickly, you work with the Roosevelt Institute, among others. I saw somebody on their blog make the comment that maybe this isn't about job creation at all. It's about warm feeling creation in corporate America a year after Citizens United looking into another campaign season. Is that what it's about, campaign contributions and the fear of antagonistic funding from corporations?
Well, I'll let the Roosevelt Institute speak for itself. I've spent a lot of time working with them, but on behalf of the Agenda Project, what I would say is that it's very clear the president is walking into a re-election campaign. It's very clear that his Wall Street backers are not going to be with him going forward. I had a guy from Wall Street send me a copy of a $25,000 check that he sent to Mitch McConnell for the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee with a note that said his new friends were substantially nicer to him than his old friends were, even though I think progressives like me would argue that, you know, we were pretty nice to Wall Street given what Wall Street did to the economy. But certainly the president has $1 billion to raise. He has a political team who is very well aware of the fact that they've got a big hill to climb, and they're not going to have the web money that they probably did last time.
Owie. Heidi, 10 seconds from you.
That's exactly right. And I think the bottom line message that we need to think about is that corporations are not people, and that we need to think in those terms, that we have a country that's built on individuals. And the most important thing right now is getting jobs to the 11 million people. And so if this competitiveness committee is going to do that, they're going to think about competitiveness in terms of investments in education and infrastructure. That'll be a great outcome. We'll wait and see what happens.
Heidi and Erica, thank you so much. We'll put links to both of your organizations at our website, GRITtv.org, and go out of this segment with this little message from some raging grannies in Florida.
Now is the law of the land. Corporations can do what once was banned. The Supremes have set a precedent. Now Walmart can be president. 'Cause business has rights, and to their delight, corporations are persons now. Fair campaigning now is a thing of the past. Those with money own the elections at last. They'll buy all the TV ad time and run their swift but ad line. They'll offer no proof our purse and